This is a webinar workshop organized by the Institut Louis Bachelier in cooperation with WWF France and in the context of the Paris Tomorrow's Week. And we are very happy to have you all in. We will start by the presentation of the report, the Alignment Cookbook that we published almost 3 months ago now, last July, during the summer, with the lead author, Julie Reynaud, and one of the co-authors, Peter Tankoff. And then we'll continue with a very nice lineup of speakers coming from almost 3 continents. I will present the speakers before, but we have, I think, the main initiative involved in the continuation or in the follow-up of the alignment dynamic that are present with reports, ongoing consultations, and new recommendation coming up. And I think we want to know what's going on there. As you know, the Alignment Cookbook was a report commanded by the French Ministry together in cooperation with WWF with a view to analyze basically the variety of tools, alignment tools and temperature tools in the market in order to feed their thought for amending the French regulation Article 173 and to come up with potential minimum requirements for this regulation context. There will be, and we may take questions on that, there will be a further report produced in cooperation with our partner for this cookbook report, which is also I4C. We have no speaker today from I4C, but you should all know that they were part of this work and that they are leading the second report that will come up with minimum requirements. I think that with no further ado, I will give the floor to Julie. And for a short introduction, this is not an in-depth introduction of the report. It's a short 10 minutes introduction of the report. Peter will follow up with a focus on the most interesting scientific academic topic, and then we will take your questions. Thank you. Julie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Hi everyone, and thank you for listening in. So I'm Julie Reynaud, I'm a member of the Institut Louis Bachelier expert network, and also co-author of the Alignment Cookbook report that the ELB published with I4CE, WWF France, and the French Ministry back in July. So on this, on your screen, you should see the first page of the report. Really, the idea was to try to increase transparency as to what temperature alignment methods and metrics are. Because we observed in the past 2-3 years, specifically, an acceleration in the availability and use and publication of this type of metrics and methodologies. We now counted over 10 of them on the market. And we also noticed that perhaps sometimes there was a lack of understanding as to what these metrics and those methods meant and captured, and of course did not capture. And so really the idea behind this report was to increase transparency and understanding for the readers around those metrics. So on the next slide, we define in this report temperature alignment methodologies very specifically. We hear about alignment all the time, and it can refer to different types of frameworks, methods, and metrics. In this report, we define temperature alignment methodologies as metrics that seek to measure the proximity between the climate performance of a portfolio and one or several temperature benchmarks chosen or built based on one or several temperature trajectories. So a multitude of metrics is available to investors to measure their climate performance. We all know about carbon footprinting, green-brown share, etc., etc. But those metrics, they cannot be used to make a dynamic and qualified assessment on the sufficiency or insufficiency of the climate performance of the portfolio, in particular with regards to the long-term global temperature objective. So for example, if I tell you my portfolio is invested in 20% in companies that are considered as green, does it tell you if it's enough? Should it be 20%, 30%, 50%? Or if I tell you the carbon footprint of my portfolio is 1,000 tons of greenhouse gases per million euro invested, okay, great, but is that good? Is that bad? Is that good enough? So temperature alignment approaches fill that gap. They allow to really make a dynamic and prospective assessment with regards to the long-term global temperature objective, or at least this is the main aim of these type of metrics. So on the next slide, you see the main recipe of temperature alignment metrics. As I mentioned, there are over 10, 15 on the markets now. They all have their own subtleties, but they all follow more or less the same steps, the same schemes. So first, you need to measure the climate performance at the company or portfolio level. So this can be captured through a technology metric, a carbon footprint metric, or even a score. The second step is to choose one or several scenarios. So we are all familiar with the IPCC scenarios, for example, or the International Energy Agency scenarios. The third step is to derive from the chosen scenarios in step 2 temperature trajectories, decarbonization trajectories that apply to the specific entity that you are trying to assess. And then the fourth step is to take, on the one hand, the climate performance of the company or the portfolio you are assessing, so the result of step 1, to take, on the other hand, the decarbonization trajectories that this entity should follow to be considered aligned with a specific temperature trajectory. So that's the result of step 3. Put that together and assess the proximity of one with the other to derive the temperature, the alignment metric, which is sometimes expressed as a temperature. So these are the 4 main steps, but of course, within each of those 4 steps, there are many methodological choices that can be made. And as always, the devil is in the details. So on the next slide, you can see some of those questions that methodology developers have to ask themselves when they put together this kind of methodology. So for example, what metric should I use? A technology metric, a greenhouse gas metric, a score? What perimeter should I take? Should I include only direct operational emissions, or should I also extend the scope to include value chain? What scenario should I choose? How do I take the trajectories from the scenarios and adapt them to the specific actors I'm looking at, etc., etc. So each methodology within each of these steps make very different choices, and many permutations of the same recipe are possible. Therefore, it is possible to imagine as many alignment and temperature methodologies as the number of possible permutations between each of those choices that you can see on this slide. So on the next slide, you see the main consequence of that. We often put in the same bucket those methods, calling them temperature alignment methods. And it gives the impression that they answer the same question. But in practice, when you deep dive, because of the specific methodological choices that are embedded in the methodologies, each of these methods answer slightly different questions. And these questions, you can see them on the next slide. and you can see that those questions are quite different from one method to another. This is not meant to be exhaustive, it's just a subset of them. So is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Is there a recipe that is more relevant than another? And is there a question that is more relevant than another to answer? So that's on the next slide. I will take the risk to disappoint you. To date, in our view, there is no ideal temperature alignment methodology. And we feel that it is up to the users to choose the methodologies that best fit the information needs, and up to the regulators to become more precise as to what minimum technical requirements methodologies should meet in order to be fit for purpose. And in the remainder of this webinar, we will hear about very interesting initiatives as well that have been put together in order to help users see clearer through the methods and derive specific criteria in order to decide whether a methodology is fit for purpose or not. The thing is that often methodology developers do not have the choice. So if you go on the next slide, what happens is that what can be considered as ideal in practice may be hard to implement, in theory, may be hard to implement in practice. And this is because of mainly data availability. So what is best from a theoretical perspective may not be easily applicable. And so on this slide, Peter, if you can change the slide, please, thank you. You can see some of the main trade-offs. I've selected 3 of them that are particularly important, but of course there are many more that are described in the report. So first, should you include value chain, should you consider the value chain perimeter? In theory, you want to include the value chain, especially for relevant sectors like in the auto sector or oil and gas or food and bev. But in practice, data is not often available, and especially data around the decarbonization trajectories that these should follow. There is also a trade-off in how do you forecast or try to estimate the future climate performance of your companies or portfolios. Do you base yourself on past performance and do an extrapolation, or do you base yourself on revealed plans and CapEx, or do you base yourself on companies' self-declared decarbonization objectives? Here again, you could be making very different choices, and each have their pros and cons and different levels of uncertainty. And of course, there is also a trade-off to be made when you choose the scenario. Most users, most methodology developers use the International Energy Agency scenarios because they are the easier to use, because the data is provided in a level of granularity, geographic and sectoral granularity, which is easier to use, but at the same time, the decarbonization trajectory depicted in those scenarios may not be the best from a precautionary principle. And on the next slide, perhaps one of the biggest topic is, should the results of the alignment analysis be expressed in a temperature metric? Because in practice, you could be expressing the results of a temperature alignment assessment in binary terms, 2-degree aligned or not. You could be expressing it in a percentage or absolute difference with the temperature trajectory, or you could be using this famous temperature metric. And this temperature metric is gaining ground because users often find it easy and quite sexy to communicate, if I may. But the question is it a really useful metric in its current state? And we argue that the user of this type of metric should be very careful. First of all, these methodologies are like lasagnas. There are uncertainties at every level of the methodology, and these uncertainties compound themselves. And while the result expressed in temperature gives the impression that it's quite simple and creates this system of equivalency with the international temperature limitation objective, it hides those multiple layers of uncertainties. It is also worth recognizing that those approaches are very simplistic in comparison to the IPCC climate models and approaches, and suffers from different limitations. So one of them is that the results are often not comparable with one another. If you take two methodologies and you test the same portfolio with those two methodologies, most likely you'll arrive at very different results. And this is what we did on the next slide. So we tested more than 10 different methodologies on both the Euronext Low Carbon 100 Index and the SBF 120 for 2 years, 2018 and 2019. And on the next slide, you can see the headline results. So the green bubble depicts the results for the low carbon 100. The blue bubble depicts the results for the SBF 120. The darker color is for the year 2019, and the lighter color is for the year 2018. And you can see that the overall results are quite different when you use different methodologies. We also tested on the next slide whether there was a linear correlation between those methods. And here again, you can see that in some instances, the linear correlation is positive, in other instances, it's negative. So it's not very conclusive. What is still reassuring is that some of the methods that share the same characteristics tend to be more highly correlated. So for example, methods that include value chain emissions are based on the emissions metrics and try to capture avoided emissions, tend to be more highly correlated with one another than with others. Of course, these results need to be taken with precaution because the sample size is very small and the results of those methods are not very stable, but it's the beginning of investigating how the results may be correlated or not. So I will stop here and let briefly Peter Tonkov describe some of the main research challenges associated with those types of metrics and methodologies.
Yes, thank you, Julie. So before letting Julie conclude her presentation, I will briefly mention some of the questions that we identified while working on the report, some of the questions for applied research in economics. So the questions are related to trade-offs that Julie mentioned, but maybe go a little bit deeper than the practical trade-offs made by methodology providers. One of the key questions is how to quantify the additionality of investor action and explore the link, if any, between the additionality of investor action and the methodologies of temperature alignment. And similarly, another interesting question is to what extent these methodologies can be useful as proxies to measure transition risks. Of course, two completely different applications, and alignment is somewhere between the two, neither a risk measure nor an impact measure, but maybe some interesting information can be derived from it for both problems. And third cross-cutting question that we identified is what would be the extra ingredients needed to assess the alignment with respect to the Paris Agreement, alignment with the Paris Agreement, compared to just the alignment to the temperature objective of the Paris Agreement that is explored in the report. Next, coming back to the question of metrics, what is the best metric, what is the best way to measure transition of economies? Regarding the Scope 3 emissions, what is the best way to distribute the Scope 3 emissions along the value chain, and in particular to avoid double counting? Then, if to compute, to evaluate for alignment assessment, especially forward-looking, we need to be able to forecast the investment decisions of agents in order to understand how the alignment will be, how to measure the alignment of the future trajectories. Finally, regarding the distribution of the emissions between sectors and regions, the existing methodologies and also between individual agents, the existing methodologies use prescriptive methods like contraction, for example. However, these methods do not take into account the actual economic dynamics and the interaction among agents. For example, the agents, you cannot directly control them. You cannot directly prescribe the emissions. You can create some stimulus, some economic stimulus like the carbon price, and then depending on this stimulus, depending on the interaction with the environment, and depending on their own objective function, the agents, economic agents, will decide on the emissions. And so it is interesting to compute these optimal trajectories for sectors and for the agents, depending on the overall trajectory for a country, using perhaps some economics tools like game theory. Now, when we come to the last step of the problem, computing the alignment measure, there is the question of aggregating the metrics at portfolio level. Of course, the current methodologies use a weighted sum with possibly different weights, but some of these metrics do not aggregate in a linear way, so non-linearity should be taken into account. And finally, a big question is that of uncertainty quantification. So as we saw in Julie's presentation, that the procedure is subject to several layers of uncertainty at different steps of the methodology. So how to quantify each part of each level of the uncertainty, and how to aggregate these different uncertainties into the final measure of uncertainty on the temperature alignment metric. Without such an uncertainty measure, this metric is much less useful. So these are the questions, and if you are interested in more details on these research aspects of the work, we have published a research article called Portfolio Alignment, Science or Art, and it is available on SSRN. And now I give the floor back to Julie for the conclusion.
Thank you very much. So in a nutshell, the main messages of the report are: number one, we are lacking a clear definition as to what is a temperature alignment methodology. Number two, at the moment, because of the trade-off between an ideal recipe and the practicalities of implementing it, these methods are more of an art rather than a science. Number three, because there are a wide range of methods that are used by investors or sold by data providers, these can yield very different results for the same portfolio, just because in the face of different methodological choices, different methodological choices have been made. So it's very well normal that these methods give very different results. And finally, even if the temperature metric seems and appears quite easy to understand and to communicate, at the moment, it is necessary to be very careful with what this temperature metric says and does not say. In particular, because of the multiple layers of uncertainties that compound within this metric, as Peter mentioned a little bit. So I will stop here. Of course, if you have some questions, Peter and I will be very happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Peter. I think that was very clear. As mentioned by Peter, more research is definitely needed on this very important topic. And actually, at the Institut Louis Bachelier, together with Peter, we are now currently working on putting together a new research initiative to deepen further this work on alignment. It's about methodologies, but it's also about data. So if you are interested in that, please come back to us. And of course, I didn't mention that, but Peter is a scientific director of the Green and Sustainable Finance Program at the Institut Louis Bachelier. Are there any questions? I know Jacob has a question, so we have only 3 minutes. So Jacob, I'm very happy to take your question. Jacob is managing director of 2 Degrees Investing Initiative, and let me make this point very clear. Jacob was the owner of the Cookbook concept applied to climate finance. So you have a right to speak now and to ask your question, Jacob.
Yeah, now that I'm getting the license fees for that, I'm about to retire. I was intrigued, Julie, by your comments about an art than a science. I think that's a really powerful message. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what thresholds would have to be met for you to qualify a metric as scientific. I understand you're grading on a curve a little bit, and maybe your comment also refers a little bit more to the way these metrics are expressed and the approaches, but maybe you can just talk a little bit more about what are the sort of the criteria these metrics have to meet to be considered scientific.
So it's a very tough question because no one has listed those criteria, and there's been a lot of work going on, you know, by the IIGCC, and we will hear a little bit about Daisy, from Daisy later on, or the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. But so far there is no consensual definition, so I can only give my opinion. My opinion is that to be considered as strong, this type of method or metrics should at least include the value chain perimeter for the sectors for which it is important. So I'm of course thinking of the usual suspect, as I mentioned, the auto, oil and gas, etc., etc. Should be using a precautionary scenario as the 2-degree benchmark. So if possible, a scenario that peaks sooner rather than later and have a strong decarbonization slope and relies very little, if not at all, on negative emissions. So these are some of the criteria I would see for these methods to qualify as strong. But of course, it is easier said than done. So this is why at the moment it is still an art, in my view.
Add a little bit. So the question is also what is needed for the metrics to qualify as scientific, and here one can give some general definition like transparent assumptions, maybe some idea of uncertainty quantification of how uncertain different parameters are, a clear notion of domain of validity, where to what sectors can the metric be applied, and then perhaps some idea of backtesting whenever possible.
Excellent. Final question from Xavier. I will read this one. What was the feedback from practitioners, asset owners and managers on the Cookbook, especially with relation to the multiple layers of uncertainties? Who want to take this one? There have been lots of feedback, but not specifically on this issue. It's one of which we want to tackle together with Peter very much in the project I mentioned. You want to comment, Julie?
No, I think you said it all. Everyone is aware of the uncertainties, but at the moment, no method seeks to capture or even quantify or qualify those uncertainties. So we are speaking of developing a whole new set of methods to do so that do not exist yet. So people generally agree, but nothing or not much is being done at the moment, unfortunately.
Still about the subject of uncertainty, we have a question from David. What will be the advantage of using game theory to predict the actions of others compared to reasoning at all other things remain constant, given the already high level of uncertainty? This is a question for you, Peter.
Yeah, I would say that using game theory reduces the uncertainty a little bit, because the assumption that all other things remain constant is a very strong assumption. And when you use game theory, you make, in a sense, a more realistic assumption about the behavior of others. And so in this sense, uncertainty or model error is reduced. But of course, this is a very long discussion that one can go on for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Without further ado, I would like to move to the panel and the panelists and introduce them. I've already introduced Jacob, but to start with, we have Daisy Streetsfield from the IGCC, leading Investors Network. Daisy is particularly involved with the alignment topic, and she's the head of Investor Practices program at the IGCC. We have Chris Weber, an old friend, now at the WWF, heading the Climate and Strategy Scientist program, I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. And also very involved in the SBT Fin initiative. Simon Messenger, CEO of the First Planet Advisory, and working together with the WWF for basically representing and stimulating the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And you will tell us more about this, Simon. And last but not least, Jacob, Managing Director at 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. Daisy, the floor is yours. Why is this topic of alignment so important, and why is it becoming so important for the IGCC?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak on this very interesting panel. And the topic is very important for our investors because many of them are trying to align their portfolios and their objectives to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as a result, a group of our asset owners approached us back in 2019 to ask us to look at this problem of how investors align, how they can measure alignment of portfolios, and how they can take effective action to transition their portfolios over time. And so we've been exploring that issue and recently launched our net zero investment framework that looked at how investors can do this effectively. And some of you I know have heard and seen the overview of the framework before, but for those who haven't, I'll just provide a short overview of that and try and share my screen if I can. Hopefully you'll be able to see it shortly. But yes, the framework itself, as I've said, was really designed to help investors think through how they would align portfolios to the goal of the 1.5 degrees or net zero emissions by 2050. And we certainly, to agree with a lot of what Julie said, we consider alignment to kind of 1.5 degrees to be much more than just achieving a single temperature metric for the portfolio. And that simplifying the dynamic of alignment and achieving net zero emissions in the real economy to one number is fairly problematic. And so the net zero investment framework proposes alignment to mean having an investment strategy that's consistent with achieving global net zero emissions by 2050. And for investors, that involves focusing on 2 objectives. The first is decarbonising your portfolio and specifically the assets associated with those portfolios. And then also looking to increase investment in the climate solutions we need to reach net zero. And the framework aims to provide recommended methodologies and approaches for both measuring alignment at the asset level and aggregate measures at portfolio level, and also taking actions that will transition a portfolio and achieve those objectives in a way that maximizes impact on emissions trajectories in the real economy. It aims to be comprehensive and to drive those effective actions by investors, and as such it uses a combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches and metrics that work together, which we think are kind of more nuanced and useful than just a single temperature alignment metric. And so the framework and the overview that is on the slide presents the sort of 3 components that are top-down and a number that are more bottom-up. And so in terms of those top-down components, these are the ones at portfolio or fund level that set the direction and portfolio structure and strategy to achieve alignment. So starting with the component on governance and strategy, that involves setting a commitment to net zero, setting your beliefs, strategy and mandates, particularly for when an asset owner is setting mandates for an asset manager around net zero, undertaking climate risk assessments, and also doing the monitoring and reporting of whether your strategy is proving effective. We also suggest setting some portfolio reference targets. These are designed to create accountability for the bottom-up strategy, achieving what you're intending, which is ultimately reducing emissions of the portfolio, but also those metrics around increasing investment in climate solutions. And then the third of the top-down components is around strategic asset allocation. So this is the way that structurally investors allocate capital, and changing your strategic asset allocation can help you to achieve greater alignment to invest more in the low carbon economy. And there are a number of actions within that we recommend, including using climate metrics in your portfolio optimization, choosing asset class variants that more closely align to a decarbonized economy, and also reviewing some of the traditional constraints that may prevent investors from making those more effective investment decisions. But the core of the framework is really at the asset class and asset level. So we also recommend setting targets and metrics for increasing the alignment of individual assets. This involves assessing individual assets using alignment criteria, and we use a criteria-based approach rather than a sort of single number of emissions performance, but those are designed to be current and future-looking metrics, as well as sort of credibility metrics around does an asset have an investment plan that is consistent with achieving net zero themselves, along with governance measures. And we recommend some methodologies that already exist in the market that allow investors to make those assessments of the underlying assets, with a view to then reaching a target for increasing the proportion of assets in your portfolio that are aligned themselves to that decarbonisation trajectory, as well as investing more in those climate solutions. And then critically, the framework also sets out the actions that investors can take to increase the alignment of their portfolios through using portfolio construction, engagement and stewardship, as well as selective divestment as a final component of an escalation strategy for engagement, and the direct management they have in the case of certain types of assets like real estate. And so they really come together as a combination of effective action, not just a measurement of alignment, but also how you go about increasing the alignment of the assets and decarbonising and increasing investment in climate solutions. And we also think some of the contextual factors are really important, so that an investor is engaging with the kind of market data providers, with their asset managers or clients, for example, to also create that system that drives towards net zero and the products that are necessary to do that, as well as undertaking policy advocacy and using their lever as an advocate for robust global national net zero policies, and also the policies that will enable greater alignment. So shareholder rights, for example, in the case of using engagement effectively, are also really important. So it really sets to produce a kind of comprehensive framework of metrics and actions that we think will really drive decarbonisation in the real economy, and uses all the levers that investors have towards alignment. And so I think this panel has posed a number of questions around what the minimum requirements should be for alignment. And I think for investors to say they're on a net zero pathway, we would see implementing the main recommendations across this framework as a kind of minimum. And that core metric of increasing the proportion of the underlying assets within a portfolio that are themselves aligning to net zero and decarbonising is the key metric of progress and real economy emissions reductions that we're trying to achieve. And regarding the question of sort of whether we should be looking to those temperature metrics and getting answers to those, or broader alignment metrics, there are just a few considerations that I would highlight that I think really speak to some of the points that Julie raised with the challenge of temperature metrics. First of all, I think it's very important to distinguish alignment metrics, whether you're looking at an individual asset or at portfolio level. The latter, given the volume of different assets, is necessarily going to be a pretty dynamic process and more complex, and potentially increases the likelihood of a metric that aggregates and may have challenges at the asset level. Aggregating up to portfolio level may actually increase the sort of complexity and chances that those metrics are actually misleading. So I think when we talk about temperature metrics and some of the challenges of alignment metrics, thinking differently about the asset level and the portfolio level is really important. And having that more nuanced sort of criteria-based approach, which looks at current and future emissions performance of assets, but also some of the other factors in terms of CapEx plans and business models going forward of companies, to really look at whether they are expected to credibly align, is really important to assess alignment, more than sort of trying to derive a figure that can be quite misleading. And the Alignment Cookbook really clearly elaborated the sort of different choices in layers of components that are used to generate a temperature metric for a given asset. And these choices and data gaps issues are only magnified once you multiply them up at portfolio level. But I think it's fair to say for any kind of measures of alignment, whether it's the adequacy of an emissions reduction target, lots of the same data issues like scope 3, whatever measure you're using are there. So I think we all have to be humble about the data challenge that any of our measures and methodologies will face going forward. But I think the final point I would like to make is really around whatever metric and measure or evidence you provide, it's not so much the number as what actions investors take while using that number that becomes important. And I think therefore we want to sort of have regimes that encourage disclosure of the actions that investors are taking, as much as, you know, a beauty contest about whether your number is 2 or 2.1, because it's really the actions in terms of engagement and stewardship, for example, where, you know, the quality of investor action there will do much more to drive emissions reductions necessarily than being able to say, today I have a portfolio that's sort of slightly degree aligned better than my competitors. So I think really that holistic approach we try and get to with the framework of not only the measures of alignment, but also the actions that investors need to take is really critical. So I think I've probably had more or less my 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there, but happy to answer any questions on the framework and the approach we've taken, or discuss in more detail some of the questions that were posed to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. That was very clear, very dense, but very clear. I just had a very quick question. What is exactly the timeline? A quick answer of the framework now.
Oh, so we have the framework open for consultation, and several people on this panel provided very useful feedback to our consultation. So we're working to update the current version of the framework to publish by the end of the year. And then we have a next phase of work looking at some of the issues that have already been identified here in terms of things like how to measure accurately scope 3 emissions and those boundary issues, and various other elements to deepen and expand the framework to new asset classes. And we're aiming to publish an updated and expanded version, also looking at the adaptation and resilience goals and alignment to those in a second version of the framework, which we're aiming to publish ahead of COP26 next year.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Daisy.
Stefan, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. I was saying to the participant, please retain your question for the moment. We'll take them after each participant has the opportunity to speak. Next, Chris, thank you very much for being here with us today. What's your agenda, Chris, and on the alignment? What's cooking in on your side of the ocean?
Well, thanks so much for having me here, Stefan and Julie. As Stefan and Julie mentioned, so I work for WWF here on the western side of the Atlantic, and I am the lead climate scientist for WWF and highly involved in the Science-Based Targets initiative. Can you, Stefan, can you confirm that you're looking at the full screen slide?
Absolutely, all clear.
Wonderful, and I apologize if you hear babies or dogs in the background, as per everyone is getting used to such sounds. But so I work very closely with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and I was involved heavily in the creation of this recent package of methods and tools for financial institutions focused on portfolio alignment. I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction to that method and tool, and then I will present some of my own views, not of WWF and Science-Based Targets Initiative. So hopefully everyone is at least broadly familiar with Science-Based Targets Initiative. We recently celebrated our 1,000th company committing to set science-based targets. And however, the financial sector has long been kind of one of the holes that we had, because we hadn't basically come up with any methods that were validated. So the last couple of years, we have been working on coming up with the kind of criteria and tools that we would be okay with financial institutions using. And one of the key outputs of this, which was just launched about 3 weeks ago, was this tool. It was led by WWF, a colleague of mine in WWF Sweden, but with our partners at CDP and WRI. We had some development partners as well, and critically the involvement of a lot of the key ESG and financial data providers in the market: Bloomberg, ISS, MSCI, Trucost, Argentum, and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. The goal we were trying to do with this tool was basically to come up with fully open source method and tool that would allow financial institutions to set science-based targets, try and make it as widely distributed as possible by working through the again, these ESG and data providers, be as transparent as possible. I think as we've heard from Julie and Daisy and others already, the variation in the methods that are out there in the market right now are so high that transparency is really a key feature. So we tried to make it very simple and clear what we're doing to kind of come up with the targets for the underlying constituents in the portfolio and at portfolio scale. Critically, we also wanted to be data agnostic so that you don't have to have a subscription to a certain provider in order to use it. That's something that is somewhat unique, I think, about this method. And also we wanted to have kind of any user interface so that you can kind of port it into different service providers' offerings, use an online API, use different ways to be able to access it. I'm going to spend 1 minute talking about the actual approach. Please see the Alignment Cookbook if you want to learn more, and I'll have some links at the end of the talk as well. Essentially, echoing kind of what Daisy was saying earlier, we start with the underlying constituents. We're using a proxy metric for alignment that's basically the underlying constituents targets for GHG reductions. So this has of course pros and cons, like any indicator does. But what we think it does well is incentivize the right types of actions for investors to take. So what we're trying to get investors to do is align their portfolio by essentially maximizing the proportion of their portfolio that has ambitious GHG reduction targets, thereby, we hope, driving the kinds of GHG reductions on the ground that we're hoping to see. Essentially, there's these open source regression models. You can find it all on GitHub, that takes the scenario families from the IPCC special report on 1.5 and calculates temperature scores associated with those targets. The targets then need to be aggregated to company level because some companies have multiple targets, some companies have no targets. So in the case where a company, say, has a scope 1 and 2 target, and they also have a scope 1, 2, and 3 target, we rectify those into one common score at company level. Then, of course, we have to aggregate to portfolio level. Because we think there's still a lot of kind of uncertainty in the market, we included 7 different aggregation methods. You can kind of pick and choose which one you want to use within the tool, and then have it allow you to do some kind of what-if analysis as well. Focus mostly on where we want investors to go first, which is on engagement, different types of engagement scenarios. What will be the effect of your portfolio score by focusing on, engaging with the top 10 companies to get them to set science-based targets, engaging with a certain sector, a certain geography, and so on. We were asked to kind of provide our views on some of these key questions coming out of the Alignment Cookbook, which I will also echo as just an excellent contribution. With the only potential criticism that it is a quite long report, but it's needed because of all of the nuance to the approach. So the first question we were given is sort of what do we see as the minimum disclosure requirements for investors and FIs that are doing portfolio alignment. You'll see here, this is kind of my ideal list. If I was in charge of implementing Article 173, this is what I would hope that we would see as the disclosure requirements. A lot of these are the kind of essential ingredients that were highlighted in the cookbook. What's the scenario being used? What's the coverage of the method, including from portfolio, asset class, and sector level? What's the KPI that you're using, and how is it being calculated? What's the weighting technique you're using? And is there a portfolio benchmark for your portfolio that's using the equivalent method score to provide some context on that score? So what's the MSCI world equivalent, for instance? Critically, I will highly agree with Daisy and take umbrage at her stealing my thunder on this message, that we don't just want to see the scores. The numbers are kind of inconsequential given the high uncertainty and variability between approaches. Instead, we want to know both what is the current value of this KPI and what are you doing about it? What is your target for achieving the future value of this KPI? You know, I'm going to align my portfolio to 1.5 degrees by 2025, for instance. And critically, what are the actions you're taking to do that, and why? Why are those the actions you're taking to try to do it? Why do you think it makes more sense to engage with your oil and gas portfolio and divest from your coal portfolio? Critically, I think it's also one of the key messages that I took out of the Cookbook report was that this idea of alignment has a lot of different people have a lot of different ideas about what it means. And I think it's important for the FI to kind of disclose why are you doing this besides where it's required, like in France. Do you think this is a proxy for impact? Do you think this is a proxy for transition risk, or not? Like what does this KPI mean to you, and why? And I think that's critical to have both these kind of ingredients and the actions and the FI views about the measurement technique, because we still have so much variability in these approaches, and there's still so much debate going on in the market. If we kind of allow the FIs or mandate the FIs to disclose all of these ingredients as well as kind of what they're doing about this, we'll accomplish two goals. First, we won't stifle continuing market innovation that's happening, and we won't cut off these very important debates about, you know, what is alignment, what is it measuring, what's the proxy for, and so on. And secondly, we'll contribute data to future analyses of what works. If we make sure that that everyone is talking about the actions they're taking, we can use that, and I'll highlight, you know, the work of my colleague Jacob, who will speak soon, and 2DI on this. They've been harping on on this topic of impact measurement for some time. We really need this data to be able to know what works. We have to have the disclosure of what everyone is trying, and so that's a really important part of the disclosure requirements as well. Finally, on this idea of whether or not we should convert to a temperature metric, basically, I think it's kind of the wrong question. It should be obvious to say this, but like portfolio temperature is an indicator. Temperature is not a method, and like all indicators, portfolio temperature has pros and cons, but those are really conflated and compounded by the pros and cons of the underlying method that's used to calculate that indicator. So what we really need to focus on is not like what's the right indicator, but instead what is the right approach to be taking, and just making sure that we're all clear on what these underlying ingredients are. I will stop there, and just to provide some links for those who are interested in learning more about the tool, you can find them at these various websites here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very useful, very interesting. We'll make sure we pass your slide number 5 to our dear friend at the I4C and even at the ministry, as it's really quite interesting, quite fruitful. I would like to skip to switch to Simon, please. And no need to introduce you further. Simon, the floor is yours right now.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and I will go straight away by sharing my screen. So good afternoon, everybody in Europe, and good morning if you're in America, so good evening in Asia. So thank you for your time today. I will give you a brief overview of the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and in particular the protocol that it released recently around target setting. So as a quick background, for those less familiar with the Alliance. It's an international group of 30 institutional investors, and they've essentially pledged to transition their investment portfolios to net zero by 2050, and therefore align their portfolios with 1.5 degrees. In France, the Caisse de dépôt was one of the founding members, and since then there have been a few other French institutions who've joined, including AXA, CNP Assurance, ERAF, FRR, and SCOR. And so as part of all of this work, the Alliance 2025 target setting protocol was launched this last month and is open for feedback until mid-November, the 13th. And this is what I'll come back to in a few minutes. So in terms of the core objectives of the Alliance, what is it trying to achieve? Well, I mean, obviously the challenge here is around climate action and achieving the 1.5 degree target. To do that, the solution, which is being, I guess, brought up, is around a coordinated action and a coordinated set of actions, really, both by the public authorities, corporations, and financial institutions. And the Alliance has come together to build these concrete actions and share knowledge and ultimately align portfolios. And this is what led, in this wider context, to the development of the protocol and all the underlying principles which are within it. So in terms of, obviously the Alliance as a whole, the core target, as I said, is to transition to net zero emissions by 2050. They've, it's now quite a diverse group. It's actually 30 asset owners now, I think no longer 28, but they've come together, with their diversity to define, approaches, which they deem to be required to reach this goal. They've made it open to the public, and they've also committed, which is relatively unprecedented, I think, by itself, to improve it annually over time. They will be reporting, I guess regularly, but annually and transparently, against their progress. They've also established, through these intermediate targets every 5 years. And they've, highlighted that the impact here has to be, seen in the real economy. So it's not just about, greening the portfolio for the sake of, greening it. You need to actually be able to, see the impact that your actions are having. And within all of this, there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in terms of, this is very much framed within the expectations, that the government will be following through also on their own commitments, and therefore, the finance sector and the asset owners in this context, are part of the overall, I guess, broader societal need to, I guess, to change the wider economy. As a side point, before I talk about the protocol, the Alliance is always, looking to grow. So if there are any asset owners who are listening right now and are interested in joining, do reach out to me if ever you're interested. But so in terms of the protocol itself, so its aim is to set out how individual members, should be setting a target achievable in the next 5 years and using the IPCC 1.5 degree pathway to inform them. It tries to balance scientific ambition, active ownership, engagement, and divestment constraints. So, it's not, it recognizes that there are, I guess, limitations and difficulties in terms of what people can do right now, both in terms of availability of data, engagement channels, and more broadly, just, hurdles which need to be overcome from a societal perspective. So looking at, Julie's presentation at the start, and, when she was listing the choice of ingredients, what it's trying to do here is to answer some of those questions, the principles around, for example, what are the metrics, what are the scenarios that should be, I guess, minimum requirements, what are the benchmarks that can be used. So as key, principles, obviously the targets here, they are set on the asset owner's own scope 3 emissions. So, some people, whether you call them portfolio emissions, finance emissions, or scope 3 emissions, obviously we're talking about the category 15 of scope 3 emissions here. It covers more broadly the wider scope 1, scope 2 emissions. But as I said earlier, there's a commitment here that Alliance members, will be publishing interim targets every 5 years. So it's not just about having obviously the 2050 goal, which is clearly extremely important as an overarching principle that people are moving towards, but it's also setting oneself much shorter term objectives, so one can actually measure progress against it. And what the Alliance has proposed is slightly different, I think, to and complementary also, but slightly different to some of the other, I guess, approaches we may have seen over previous years, in that it really is looking at 4 different angles. And, this is what we have on the screen right now, the 4-part Alliance Target Protocol, which looks at sub-portfolio emission targets, sector targets, engagement targets, and financing transition targets all together. So in terms of the sub-portfolio targets, this is very much about, covering asset classes, setting targets in asset classes where credible methodologies and sufficient data coverage exists today. So in this specific context here at the moment, in terms of asset classes, we're looking at corporate bonds, equities, and real estate. Further developments, there will be sovereign debt, which will be included. But this is the kind of, I guess, one of the 4 parts of targets that should be, I guess, developed. There's then sector targets, which will be more like intensity-based sector-specific targets. And in terms of initial sectors to look at, the Alliance identified, and this is partly linked to availability of, data, knowledge, and general know-how, oil and gas, utilities, the broader transport sector, so civil aviation, shipping, and road transport, and then steel. But on top of these targets, the asset owners who are members of the Alliance should also look to engage with the top 20 emitters, or those which are responsible for 65% of their portfolio emissions. So there really is an emphasis here that it's not just about setting a target and then doing it in silo without working with your companies. There's a big I guess sort of big emphasis on the fact that there should be a dialogue in this process, and it could be done on an individual level, or it could be done collectively via some of the other initiatives which already exist at the moment. And the last one is around financing transition targets, and this is more the broad long-term targets which contributes to the net zero economy. So this protocol, I said, was launched in the last month. There is a deadline in the middle of November for the consultation. You're able to access the protocol, which I think is about 70 pages long, roughly, from the UNEP-FI website, and the questions are very clearly listed in there if ever you wish to respond, which obviously we would like to encourage you to do. In terms of the other questions which both panelists have touched on around, the view on minimum requirements, soft law, hard law, etc., it's, I guess, quite a good thing that there isn't a huge disparity in opinions, I think, between us, which, I think is showing that slowly the sector's coming together in terms of opinions. But I think, for, the question around soft law, versus hard law, for me, it's very much, in terms of the question being, what is the best option, that also incentivizes the market innovations on alignment. To me, it's a mixture of both soft, and hard law, because there's a risk in being overly prescriptive. If you're mandating a specific methodology or tool, that may mean that you end up going down the wrong route in due course. But that said, general principles around the quality of disclosures, data, scope, boundaries, and so forth need to be addressed and set in, I'm going to say set in stone, but at least that there's a common understanding for all of the actors that if you are to set your target, this is really the minimum level that one should be using. So there's 3 different areas within that which I think need to be looked at. There's the the technical requirements, the ambition, and the process. And I think each of these require a slightly different approach. So in terms of process, to my previous point, I think actually it's very difficult right now because a lot of the methodologies are new and being developed to formally mandate one approach versus another. However, it must be made clear what a methodology or tool would allow you to do versus another one. And I think that's actually, if we look at the Cookbook, one of the the very strong added values that it brings is that it addresses some of those questions. In terms of the ambition, I think this will be driven, both by leading organizations such as Asset Owner Alliance members, and regulation, scientific evidence, political commitments. But I don't, think necessarily one needs to, I guess, formally mandate a specific bit insofar as, when we're looking at what is happening right now around COP26, the net zero goals is what the broader market is gearing up to. There's a large number of initiatives ahead of COP26, which are really pushing the wider financial market towards, I guess, this being the baseline expectation. There's the Race to Zero Global campaign, which is an example which right now is, truly building momentum, around the need to shift to a decarbonized economy. So I think so that's one of the angles. And I think that the bit where there, should be, I guess, possibly a slightly harder, I guess, level of, what we got given was hard law, but a harder level of principles is around the technical requirements bit. And there should be a threshold that can be set and agreed collectively. And each jurisdiction, if we're looking at it from a regulatory perspective, may have its own rules, but there would at least be common principles, for a target to be deemed acceptable, around the granularity of the data, the forward-looking element to it, transparency requirements, and other bits which have been mentioned today. And finally, transitioning, but finally, in terms of the question around, the need for temperature metric versus alignment, I think it was Peter actually who illustrated it well with all the different questions on the screen, and that I don't personally think that it's necessarily one versus the other. It depends very much on the question that we're looking to answer in terms of, is it impact, risk, alignment, ambition, what is the comparability bit that we're looking at, we're trying to compare one and the other, or set a specific target. And there was one example which they need to be credited, I guess, for transparency, and they specifically did it. But if you look at like BNP's TCFD report last year, they showed that they worked with two providers, and when they were looking at the equity portfolio, one of them gave them a temperature alignment of 2.3 degrees and one gave them a temperature alignment of 4.3 degrees, which I think reflects a lot of the challenges right now around the granularity of sector pathways, data availability, and so forth. So, my final point, just before I conclude, is around the point around what question are we trying to add, and what is the value of creating a temperature metric versus a sector alignment. Can you if you're just producing a temperature number for the sake of having a number from a comms perspective, what are we truly I guess achieving here, and how do you to be able to reach that number, how can you add one sector to another? How do you avoid double counting? What are the key accounting rules that should be set? So trying to aggregate everything, certainly at this stage, is extremely difficult. And whilst there should absolutely be portfolio level long-term targets in terms of, say, the net zero 2050 ambition, a multifaceted approach, I think, which has sector level targets, engagement targets, and others, is likely, certainly in the short term, but most likely also in the long term, to I guess drive the most impact. But obviously we can discuss that in the Q&A session after Jacob has his moment to shine.
Thank you, Simon. Very clear. Thank you. Very interesting thoughts as well. As you said, it's floor is for you, Jacob. I think you've been taking a different journey to the one of the SBT film, but please tell us about your agenda and for 2DI, but also for PACTA, and on your own view as well. It will be very interesting, as Chris did, to have your own view about the topic.
Sure, with pleasure. And thanks for the opportunity to speak today. It's such an illustrious panel. It's really cool to get this discussion going. I wish we had another couple of hours to get into some of those issues that were surfaced. I'll take the liberty of briefly saying two words about my background in that of 2 Degrees Investing Initiative's thinking on alignment. So as Stefan said, I'm Managing Director at 2 Degrees Investing Initiative Germany, and over the last couple of years, I've been overseeing a lot of the PACTA development. We now have a new colleague as head of PACTA who's doing some of that work, and obviously that was one of the approaches featured in the report. Our philosophy on PACTA is, I think, mirrors a lot of the criteria that have been defined. It's open source, it's IP rights free, it's something that can be used independently from 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. It's not commercially based. So that means there's no kind of additional revenue for 2 degrees as a function of the number of users. We have it available through our platform, where we have, I think, about 600 portfolios get tested every month, and bilaterally through banks and investors using it as a desktop solution. And of course, we also work with governments in Switzerland, Austria, Norway, Sweden, to name a few, and financial supervisors, including the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority and the Japanese Financial Services Agency, all of which use PACTA, and I think especially that governmental and supervisory angle helps drive standardization. Because as within PACTA, as with some of the other approaches, there are options around how to parameterize some of those challenges that Julie also highlighted. But by operating off of a consistent platform, governments have the opportunity to create comparability while allowing that type of flexibility and innovative potential that's been described earlier. So in Switzerland, for example, on November, in a couple of weeks, they'll be publishing the meta report with 179 Swiss financial institutions that have all run PACTA on the same platform. But when they get their results, they get to actually choose some of the parameters of how it's run to be able to see the distinctions between the choices you make. I want to maybe just briefly go on a few of the issues that have been surfaced and just give it kind of a view or a quick tease about what one could think about as one thinks about this. So as is outlined in the Cookbook report, one question is, how do you really, when we talk about alignment, what we're trying to ask is there's this macroeconomic challenge, and we're trying to ask whether the microeconomic actor, that is the financial institution, the portfolio, the company, the asset, is consistent with that macroeconomic challenge. And of course, immediately, in order to answer that question, the first methodological challenge that any alignment methodology developer has to face is, how do you divide the burden? And I think one of the interesting things here is that there is somehow a key distinction between those approaches that divide that burden as a function of very simplistic options. So in PACTA, it's basically a function of your market share. And those that use more sophisticated approaches, I would argue actually Carbon Tracker's cost curve approach, where you allocate it based on economic efficiency considerations, is sort of is one of the alternatives that's being used. And I think that's quite interesting, because by using more sophisticated approaches, you obviously open yourself up to more gamification, or the ability to game the results, but you might be more accurate. And there's always a trade-off, I think, with alignment between that accuracy and adding sophistication that creates more of a black box outcome. The other question that's really interesting is, when we think about alignment with financial institutions, we're obviously trying to understand how these economic assets relate to financial institutions. Chris talked briefly about aggregation approaches, and there's actually been very little innovation on that. I think a lot of the approaches being used are still very similar to the carbon footprinting approaches from 10 plus years ago. That's really interesting to think about, well, maybe to think about the financing footprint actually. So how is the money being intermediated? Or, some investors are thinking about allocating their economic, the company's activities, not based on the percent of the shares that they own, but the percent of their voting power. So if you own shares in Facebook, you own 10% of the shares, but your voting power is only 1% because of Mark Zuckerberg's voting structure. Is it really appropriate for you to get the responsibility for 10% of the company's business? So I think this is kind of interesting to think about innovative approaches, and maybe even to eventually get to a point where you can allocate emissions based on the impact you're having. I was really struck by what Peter said about the application domain. I think this is really a key challenge here, because often there's this ambition from asset owners and others to think about, okay, we want something that works for all asset classes, that works for all sectors. And obviously, the more you do that, the more you have to compromise on the quality, because for certain asset classes, as highlighted by Daisy, we're just not there where we want to be necessarily. And so I think one of the sort of important conclusions that we took when we developed PACTA was not to develop a portfolio level metric, because we felt like our application domain was a discrete number of sectors with a discrete number of technologies, and representing a portfolio level metric would be misleading. And here I have to disagree. Personally, I think probably most of my colleagues would agree at 2 degrees investing initiative, but particularly in personal capacity, Stefan, as you mentioned. With Chris, I think implied temperature metrics are quite harmful, because they suggest that there is a scientific capability to measure somehow a 2.715 degree warming potential of a portfolio, when the underlying methods don't have the sophistication to justify that metric. And I think here it's quite important to remember that, you know, we work in and we operate in sort of this community of experts or sustainable finance professionals, but at the end of the day, a lot of this communication goes to the public. And it's maybe easy for us collectively to disentangle different models and to read the 2,000-page Cookbook report or the follow-ups. But if you get to a place where an investor says we're on a 2-degree pathway, when really given the complexity of the challenge, you're not in any reasonable position to say that. You communicate that publicly to users. It's no longer a question of sort of, okay, we're experts and there's pros and cons. It's actually telling a message to the public. And I think we should remember that. And sometimes the sustainable finance community forgets that this is a message to the public. And in order to be science-based, I think Peter's framing is really powerful. You need to have the application in implied temperature metrics, since they cannot consider negative emissions technologies or carbon capture and storage, are unable to deliver on that application domain. And so I think rightly in the conclusion of the Cookbook report are an art and not a science. It's not to comment on the challenge of scoring. We can obviously have scores, 3 leaves, 5 stars, 3 bananas. Why not score portfolios? Influence Map does that, as I highlighted in the report. But representing those scores as temperature metrics, I think, is problematic. That's probably the area of disagreement with Chris and maybe others. And part of that is driven by my sense that the users are not just sustainable finance professionals, but the public, and they deserve metrics that are coherent and have a certain degree of integrity. There's obviously also commercial and business model concerns here, because obviously when you start to get to a point where BNP can see, okay, one provider gives me a 2.3 degree warming, the other 4.3 degree warming. Okay, so I pick the one that gives me the nice warming. And if you have maybe less integrity than BNP has in their disclosures that Simon highlighted, you end up basically race to the bottom. I want to close by talking about what is the science of alignment. I also asked Julie this at the top, right? So in basically all of corporate target setting frameworks that have been developed over the years, notably by GHG protocol, a key premise of something being science-based in the context of target setting is that it leads to real-world emissions. It's a core premise of target setting frameworks developed by GHG protocol. There's recalculation requirements in the scope 3 guidance of GHG protocol and the scope 1 and scope 2 guidance. That means that if you don't reduce emissions, but simply have emissions traded to another actor in the system, you're not science-based. You're not really setting proper targets. And I think the financial industry graduate to that level as well. We need to really move towards making sure that there are real-world emissions reduction and not just virtual emissions reductions as emissions get moved around the system and transferred from one portfolio to another. It's going to be a pretty fundamental change in the psychology, because portfolios is your unit of accounting, and it's what makes sense. And alignment is the language of the Paris Agreement. So, and it's what relates to risk as well. So portfolios is obviously what you want to think about. And you know, Daisy, you highlighted in the Paris Agreement work that you're doing, that's the unit that you're thinking about. But when even a company, when they set a science-based target and they have a massive divestment of coal-fired power plants, they're not allowed to count that for their progress on their target. And so financial institutions massively divesting from assets or changing the asset composition of their portfolio without real-world emissions reductions, I fear, are potentially using scientific approaches when it comes to alignment, but are not really following the science in a broader sense. And that, of course, means real-world emissions reduction. So I think we need to think about not just alignment as what are the right metrics, this approach, this sector, this asset class, but also challenge the premise of the boundary of what is the portfolio the right boundary, or do we need to think about actually the real-world emissions the same way, incidentally, that companies are required to do for the better part of the past decade when they sign and develop science-based target. So maybe I'll leave it at that as a note of encouragement, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jacob, for the very sound and honest comments. Very interesting. Is there, I mean, do you want each of you in the panel react to what have been said by your colleagues? Chris, do you want to react to what Jacob said, or Daisy, before I take some questions from the audience?
I can quickly say that I think no one has a claim on what science is or isn't. You know, we like reasonable people can disagree about what it means to be science-based and not. And I am in full agreement with Jacob that you know, that we need to be moving towards impact-based measurements. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we have the tools to be able to do so yet. And I think that until we do, the best we can do is measure alignment and ask for disclosure of alignment, targets, and actions in the hopes that when we are able to measure the impact, we'll be able to kind of know who has been you know, doing what. I'll stop there maybe.
Just Chris, do you think that we can still make significant progress on these tools and methodologies?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I see the value in alignment measurement. I do think that it's important, as I said in my comments, for investors to disclose what they think alignment means and whether they think it's a proxy for transition risk and or impact, which are the end goals for presumably what we're trying to get investors to do. Alignment is not a proxy for either of them, but I think let's say it is a poor proxy for both of them. And in some cases it might be better than others. So I think it's important to you know, get those disclosures so that we can continue that discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Daisy, you look like you want to add something.
Yeah, I think I have a sort of point of agreement with Jacob and also a question for him, which is, yeah, I think one of the real challenges is as you look under the hood at each level, actually what is effective action, what is driving real emissions reductions from a particular company. As you say, a company selling off its assets is to another company is just as bad as an investor selling off theirs. So what is the investor doing to get the company, say, to decommission their coal power plants in an effective way and invest in renewables rather than, you know, using easy wins, I guess. And I think that lends itself to kind of really the detailed work you need to do at kind of sector level and even at company level going forward that can't be measured with a simple metric. One thing I did want to ask about though in terms of getting that impact is we had a lot of discussion among the 70 or so investors involved in the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative around the role of divestment and some quite different views potentially when it comes to what are the tipping points. If we have enough investors saying, you know, we will divest from these kinds of companies in 2-3 years as kind of pathway sales, we can no longer be invested. What is the effect of that action potentially? At the moment, the sort of limited divestment we see and any individual investor divesting will have probably very limited impact, particularly in equities. But over time, if we have collective kind of moves in the same direction, what kind of do we see in terms of evidence, in terms of changes of cost of capital and things? And I wondered if that was forming part of the work you're doing on kind of impact and potential impact of investor action.
I think if I can respond to that, Stefan, I think in some ways, and this is one of the mistakes I personally made, is in some ways this discussion between alignment and impact is a little bit of a red herring insofar as the alignment is kind of a word used and we automatically assume it means portfolios. But why can't we mean alignment for a set of assets that we're engaging with in the CA 100+ initiatives? Why can't alignment be a boundary of assets that we're divested from? I mean, the finance industry is the only industry in the world that I'm aware of, at least in the sustainability practice, where you divest from your assets. Those are the companies you're targeting. You measure progress for all the other companies except for the companies that you're targeting. It's kind of a confused approach, right? If you're measuring the people who are involved in divestment, the way they measure progress on divestment is the extent to which they've implemented the divestment and reduced emissions as a result, which means you're measuring effectively emissions reduction for all the companies that in your portfolio except just those ones that you're targeting with your action. And that's I think a challenge. So I don't think we need to necessarily think it's alignment versus impact, but we need to start thinking about what is the universe of assets for which we want to measure alignment. And that is, I think, a space where there are metrics. There's nothing that prevents an investor today, and indeed AP2 is a great example for doing that, that measures the alignment of their portfolio, but also measures the extent to which that's driven by changes to portfolio composition. And they find they had, I think in their 2018 report or 2019 report, 3% emissions reduction because of in their portfolio, but actually the portfolio companies increased their emissions by 7%. And hiding that truth means that if you're working towards target setting, if you don't show that reality, you will never be able to graduate to thinking about impact because you're unable to disentangle the real world from the fake. And I think that's a challenge. There's this assumption that we can somehow jump from portfolio alignment to impact. And I think what we need to do, the only way we can achieve that jump is if we drop the portfolio and think about alignment holistically in terms of emissions reduction. And when it comes to divestment, I mean, I'll say two things, right? So we're in the middle of this big Swiss project right now with 179 investors. I probably shouldn't talk about it, but I'm just going to say two quick comments, which is the first thing what we're seeing is the reality of divestment policies is that they're not necessarily implemented the way they're often communicated, right? We see a lot of portfolios where there are divestment commitments, but not actually really full divestment in practice. And I think whatever you want for it to be successful, if you're creating these thresholds and not effectively implementing it, it's going to be hard to find the impact that you want. And I think the other aspect is that actually it's perfectly reasonable to assume that divestment can be effective. There is some preliminary evidence that companies that are exposed to divestment policies are changing their plans. We're seeing that in, very preliminary in some of the data coming out of this Swiss work. So I think there's a reasonable, it's part of the toolbox or the cookbook or the recipe. I don't think the comment of saying, oh, you have to, portfolio alignment doesn't equal impact, says that divestment cannot be part of the equation. It just means that if we want to actually measure progress on divestment, we should be measuring the trajectory of the divested companies or the divested assets, not everything else but.
Thank you, Jacob. Simon, do you want to add something?
Not to that specific question. I think Jacob's will be covered. I think the majority of the...
Okay, then I would like to take the two questions from the audience. Why double counting is considered such as an important barrier? All companies in the value chain are impacted by their own emissions, their supplies and product emission. It illustrates how it can be a risk multiplier and pushes for value chain collaboration, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree.
Agree, I don't think it's a barrier at all.
Okay, go on, Chris.
I was just saying I agree with the question. I don't think double counting is a barrier at all.
No objection?
No objection. I think it's a general point that it needs to be accounted for and taken into consideration. So when methodologies and tools are developed, and I know, from a 2 degrees perspective, they're very clear in terms of selecting a specific actor within the value chain to avoid double counting. So I think it's more general, point that double counting needs to be considered and reflected and certainly accounted for, but it's not like an impossible barrier that can't be overcome.
Maybe just one brief addition to that. I think tying into that double counting is a question of the metric, and ultimately, right, part of what we think about when we say alignment is alignment with something, right? And that alignment is a climate scenario. And so one of the challenges, I think, at least in my view, is that quite a number of alignment approaches are taking the scenario and then converting them into other indicators. And I think if we were more stringent in making sure that the indicator you have in your alignment method is the exact same indicator that is actually in the climate scenario, you can partially address some of that double counting by design, because if you're taking like the climate scenario indicator around the emissions intensity of power production, then you're isolating that concept within the scenario, and you can isolate that concept within your portfolio as well. Emissions intensities over financial units like enterprise value or this type of thing have a higher risk of running into the conflating of different emissions concepts.
Thank you, Jacob. I'll summarize the next question. What is the likely timeline for integrating all these initiative methods and provide basically standardization and data guidance, and hopefully not taking too long to do that? In another word, I would like to ask you, Daisy, what are your expectations, for example, for COP26 on these issues? And I mean, that could be a question for all of you, actually.
Well, I hope what we'll see is an increasing number of investors setting objectives around taking action to achieve net zero. As we've discussed today, that has many components to it, and I don't know that we'll get all investors to set net zero 2050 targets or interim targets, but the more investors we have taking action to influence the trajectories of their companies, their assets, managing and engaging in the right way, the better. I mean, and the frameworks that various groups are providing, I think, provide those tools. And I think we see increasingly, as we're all working on these problems, sort of increasing numbers of common approaches and solutions coming out. And we all share some of the same challenges which we need to address together on kind of the knotty questions of measuring Scope 3 emissions and appropriate use of offsetting, and all of these are kind of in development. So I think both seeing more and more investors taking action and committing to take action, and then more collaboration and expert input to address some of those challenges is the trajectory we need to go in. And it's been amazing to me since we started this project just to see how much the mindset of investors has moved from climate as a financial risk to how do we have impact on the challenge of getting to net zero. And if that transition in mindset is going to go by even within our members, then I think we're making good progress.
Thank you. And other comments?
Maybe just briefly, I think this is partly not kind of the responsibility of us, but it's partly a governmental challenge. And I think Stefan, you've been involved in Article 173 since the beginning as well. There is just for some reason this fear of governments to say, all right, this is how we're going to do it now. And if at some point you have to, and if you won't, there won't be this like spiritual joining of souls, and there will always be some healthy, disagreement. And if governments really want that, then they're going to have to somehow make a call at some point. Might not necessarily always be the right call, but they'll have to make one. I think we are obviously from our side trying, we're working with Carbon Tracker on integrating that into the PACTA tool, working with the Poseidon Principles, Rocky Mountain Institute, working with Influence Map on integrating that. So we are creating really this open source platform on our side. But I think at the end of the day, if you want this type of standardization, you cannot really realize that without some type of governmental role.
Your view, Simon?
I think that's fair, and I think, the regulators and the supervisors, they've started, I guess, taking a much more prominent role in the last 18 to 24 months on this topic. So I would echo to a large degree, what Jacob just said. I think, in terms of the, if we take in, like, say, the protocol from for the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, it's not necessarily reinventing a new methodology or a new tool or new data gathering process. It's really about seeing what is already being done in the field and the market at the moment, and agreeing amongst its members what a minimum, I guess, level of expectation and principles should be to precisely to drive action. And then in due course, it may then be that the regulators or the supervisors set their own requirements, which is what truly catalyzes the field. But obviously I echo Xavier's point that it'd be good if we didn't take 10 years to come to a solution on this.
Chris, any last on this before we close this panel?
I would largely agree with Jacob. I think standardization is basically in the realm of governments. The people, data providers that are trying to sell a product have no incentive to standardize their product with their competitors. It has to be someone like a government or an impartial standard setter like coming in. Trouble is, I don't think we have an impartial standard setter like outside of governments for this sector. There's no one like the sort of the GHG protocol is for the corporate sector. There's no obvious home outside of a government. So I think it has to be kind of the EU or France or one of the leading governments kind of just saying this is how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Chris. There's a question about basically about is there research to align investment portfolio to macroeconomic scenarios. my understanding is that I think this question is upside down. It should be rather the other way around, I believe. But if you want to respond, I mean, in our view, at least, I think we need multiple scenarios. It's a question that we have. I mean, we probably need multiple scenarios, not to align financial flows, but to basically improve the management of risk towards these scenarios. When it comes to alignment, I think we need one good solid scenario and to able comparison. But that's, I mean, do you want to elaborate on that? One central scenario, or do you favor multiplication of scenarios? I changed slightly the question. I'm sorry, but I think it makes sense.
I think you're right, Stefan, right? So I think it's always careful about kind of like building the scenario you want versus trying to start the alignment approach from defining the norms first and then referencing your alignment against that. I think Julie articulated that very eloquently a moment ago. But it is, I mean, one of the reasons why 2 Degrees Investing Initiative as an organization started with this concept of alignment on climate, given the presence of these types of scenarios. And so that was, in some ways, I mean, beyond the fact that it's an existential risk, an intuitive way to start, but it's actually a good thing to interrogate, like, how can you conceptualize this concept of alignment across other sustainability issues, other macroeconomic trends? And so I think it's a relevant research question. I think we have to be careful about going down this road of sort of, you know, starting with the alignment and then finding the scenario. I don't think that's the intention of the question, I should say, but I think it risks getting there if you start with the alignment and then figure out this scenario as you go.
Daisy, what's your position on scenarios? Or what's the IGCC position on scenario?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has become a little bit confusing for a lot of investors, particularly coming to this new, is and we tried to separate out the concepts when we looked at alignment with kind of the Paris goals and 1.5 degrees and what you might do in terms of scenario analysis for risk management, because you want to be using a set of different scenarios to think about your risks in different outcomes when you think about risk analysis, but you might be wanting to be more focused on a particular outcome you're trying to achieve, i.e. net zero, and a more limited band of, I guess, then scenarios which we call pathways in our net zero investment framework to try and create some of that distinction. So I think there's also a question of the right tools for the right sort of tasks, and scenarios are used now in a number of different ways by investors. So I think just really understanding what the purpose is and then what the assumptions that go into the different potential group of scenarios or pathways that you use for different tasks is really important, and something we do a lot of work helping support our members to understand, because I think it is a pretty complicated area as to what goes into those kinds of scenarios and pathways and what their different use cases are depending on the task at hand.
Chris, I'm sure you have an educated view on this.
I think I do, and the answer is not an either or, it's a both. We clearly, this dates back to, you know, when the TCFD was just being discussed, like this reference scenario question was one of the central ones, and I'll be honest, I think they screwed it up. I think the clear answer, like if you're putting a disclosure standard in place, you have to have a standard way to disclose, like by definition. And given the huge variation in 2 degree, quote unquote, or 1.5 degree scenarios, you can't allow people to choose their own, like to have a standardized disclosure. So there's a clear need to have a reference scenario. There's also a clear need for investors to be able to say, we don't like that reference scenario, and thus we're also showing the results for this scenario, and here's the difference between the two. Like it seemed clear in my mind from the start that there should have just been a do both kind of answer, and it was a false dichotomy from the beginning.
I agree. I think investing is about building your own scenario in general. Yeah. Is there a last comment, Simon?
No, in view of time, nothing to add to what the CF said.
Thank you, Simon, in the view of time, indeed. So thank you very much, all of you, for your participation to this panel. I think it was very, very interesting. It should be replayed for at least 1 week. I'm speaking under the control of Christelle. But really, thank you again, Julie, Peter, Daisy, Simon, Chris, and Jacob for these very interesting thoughts. And I'm sure we'll see you, hopefully see you again, but hear from you very soon with many new developments coming up on this alignment story. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.